Welcome everyone to our training on Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. This is a 4-part training series covering the upgrade from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. My name is Brian Nice. I am a Principal Program Manager within our Teams Engineering, Customer, and Partner team. Before we dive in, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Some additional resources include additional modules that can be found at aka.ms/Teams Academy. Additionally, we're looking for 2 types of feedback. For feedback on this session, you can go to aka.ms/Teams Community, create a new post, and add the IT Pro training tag. This will allow us to easily find your feedback for this session. If you're looking to provide feedback for various features of the Teams product itself, you can go to aka.ms/Teams Feedback. Keep in mind that Teams and Office 365 evolve constantly, so you should stay up to date on our blog at aka.ms/Teams blog. The slide also indicates the current version of this presentation. You are currently in Part 3, Coexistence and Interoperability. In this training, we're going to cover the Managing Coexistence and Interoperability agenda point. The previous agenda items were covered in the prior trainings, and the remaining agenda item will be covered in a subsequent training. Some key learnings here. Coexistence, by definition, involves both the Skype for Business client and the Teams client working together within the same organization. You will utilize what we call coexistence modes to control the user's experience during the upgrade process. If you are utilizing Skype for Business on premises, proper Azure AD Sync is absolutely critical, and hybrid, or what we call split domain configuration between the on-premises Skype for Business world and the online Skype for Business world is necessary. Let's dig into coexistence and interoperability. Let's begin by level setting some of the terminology we'll be using in this training. First, by definition, coexistence is the presence of both the Skype for Business client and the Teams client. As we'll see throughout the rest of this training, we could be utilizing these applications side by side. We could be utilizing one as a primary application, but the idea is that coexistence simply means that both the Skype for Business client and the Teams client are present in the organization. Interoperability refers to chatting or calling between a Skype for Business and a Microsoft Teams user within the same tenant. Interoperability specifically refers to chat and calling. Meetings always work within the application in which they were scheduled, meaning if it's a Teams meeting, you will join that with a Teams client. If it's a Skype for Business meeting, you will join that with a Skype for Business client. This is regardless of what type of coexistence mode is applied to the user. Federation, by definition, is chatting or calling between a Skype for Business or a Teams user and a Teams user and a Teams user, but they are in different tenants. That's a key distinction between interoperability and federation. Federation encompasses chat and calling as well as meetings, but the same rule still applies, which we discussed earlier. Meetings that are scheduled in Skype are joined with Skype for Business clients. Meetings scheduled with Teams are joined with Teams clients. So how do we manage the coexistence experience as part of the upgrade? Coexistence is managed through 2 components. The first component being what we call the coexistence mode, which we will set utilizing the Teams upgrade policy. The second component is an upcoming component that we call the Teams app permissions policy. Now, the difference between the two, the Teams upgrade policy or the coexistence mode, that governs 3 specific things. It governs the routing of the incoming messages and calls. So where do chats, where do calls land? In which client do I initiate chats and calls from? Now, the coexistence mode also will leverage that upcoming Teams app permissions policy to provide the correct user experience within the Teams application. We'll dig into that a little more coming up here. And the third thing that the coexistence mode governs is in what service do you schedule meetings? Remember, you can join meetings with either client regardless of coexistence mode. The coexistence mode is all about scheduling of meetings. Now the modes themselves, they are designed to be per user assignments that you use the traditional Office 365 admin tools. So the Skype for Business and Teams Admin Center, or what we commonly refer to as Modern Portal or PowerShell. The modes themselves can be assigned to both online users as well as on-premises users. The only exception is the Teams-only coexistence mode cannot be assigned to an on-premises user. The user must have their Skype for Business account moved online for us to be able to assign them the Teams-only mode. I'll dig into that in a little bit more detail over the coming slides in this session. Now, it is possible to also configure these coexistence modes as a tenant-wide default, or what we call an org-wide setting. Now, in the case where you have an org-wide setting configured, but then you also set a coexistence mode for an individual user, the per user setting will override the org-wide setting. Now, if necessary, you can certainly mix and match the coexistence modes across the organization. Generally, we want to advise that you keep your interop scope and duration to the minimum necessary so as to achieve the smoothest transition possible from Skype for Business to Teams. So what are the coexistence modes that we've been talking about? There are 5 coexistence modes. The first coexistence mode we've talked about in our earlier training sessions, and that refers to our Teams-only coexistence mode. This is the final destination, or the upgrade state, if you will, for an end user. And when a user is assigned the Teams-only mode, remember their account for Skype for Business must be in online for them to be able to be assigned this particular mode. That simply means that all of their calls and chats will be initiated from and land in the Teams application. All of their meetings will be scheduled as Teams meetings. They will have all the collaboration features available within the Teams application. And this is our final end state. As of October 1st, this is also the default state for net new tenants that are under 500 seats. So if you go and provision a brand new tenant, it will be provisioned in Teams only mode upon creation. Now, the next 3 modes that we see here all kind of go hand in hand together. These are all of the what we call the Skype for Business star, or the Skype for Business modes, right? The first one here is Skype for Business with Teams Collab and Meetings. The big scenario that we have here is with Skype for Business with Teams Collab and Meetings mode, also known as our Meetings First scenario. Calls and chats are initiated from and received in the Skype for Business client. Meeting scheduling and collaboration features are available within the Teams application itself. This is an excellent mode that we can utilize in on-premises scenarios that allow customers to benefit from moving Teams meetings, or moving meeting functionality, I should say, into Teams in the cloud if they're not yet ready to move other workloads like enterprise voice, for example. The Skype for Business with Teams Collab mode essentially provides the capability for the collaboration features, which you see here, right, to be available within the Teams application, but all of the remaining UC type modes, calling, chats, meeting scheduling, those are retained within the Skype for Business world. Generally speaking, this is the mode that we recommend as a starting point for the more complicated on-premises deployments, or an organization that wants a very methodical, predictable type approach. But in this particular instance, all the calls and chats are always routed to a predictable location, which is Skype for Business. There is also what we call the Skype for Business only mode, and you can see it's very similar to the prior mode. The only difference here is in a Skype for Business only mode, effectively the Teams application is only used to join Teams meetings and perhaps maybe for some specialized scenarios within an org, maybe a line of business app or something of that nature. But we don't expose all the various functions of the Teams application itself. Last but not least is the mode that we call Islands. The Islands mode is designed to be a true side-by-side experience where you have the capability of using all features in both clients. So calls and chats, meeting scheduling, they're available in both applications for the users. So they could use either client to send and or receive chats, calls, and schedule both Teams meetings as well as Skype for Business meetings. This is the default mode that is set for tenants in the online space. This is a great way to evaluate both clients side by side. And this assumes that we are going to reach saturation of the Teams application for our entire organization. Now, some of the modes that you see here are not yet available in the Skype for Business and Teams Admin Center. They are all available through PowerShell, but they're not yet, the ones that are marked with the asterisk are not yet available in the modern portal or the Skype for Business and Teams Admin Center. And in some cases, they're also not yet fully implemented, meaning we will be able to control the routing aspects, all the components that we see here from a routing perspective with any of these modes, but the pieces that rely on app permissions policy that are going to take away various features from the Teams client, those are not yet in place at this time. We're looking to preview that by the end of this calendar year and then look to release it into the first half of calendar year 2019. Teams only mode is the mode that will apply to a user when they are successfully upgraded to Microsoft Teams. As you can see in the upper right corner, the Teams client will handle the chat, calling, meeting scheduling, and collaboration aspects. Focusing on calling and chat, this means that a user in Teams only mode will receive any chats and any calls in their Teams client, regardless of where those calls originated. This user can also initiate chats and calls from the Teams client only. The Skype for Business application will still be present, but it will be in an optimized meetings mode configuration that will not permit them to create new chats or new calls. Users that are in Teams only mode can continue to use existing Skype for Business IP phones, or what we have also referred to as third-party IP phones or 3PIP phones. These phones run Skype for Business firmware, but have the capability of connecting through a gateway in our service that allow them to function for users that have been upgraded to Teams only mode. As a result of being placed into Teams only mode, Teams presence will now be shown in both systems because Teams will control the presence experience. The screenshot you see in the bottom left here showcases the Skype for Business client after a user has been successfully upgraded to Teams only mode. You'll notice there are two buttons, the Go to Teams button, which will allow the user to actually open the Teams client, and the Start Skype for Business button, which will open up the optimized Skype for Business client for meeting mode purposes. Speaking of meetings, on the right-hand side, when a user is in Teams only mode, this ensures that meeting scheduling only is available in Teams. As such, the Outlook plugin will be changed to a Teams meeting add-in, and the Skype for Business meeting add-in will be removed. And the end user will be able to schedule meetings from either that Outlook add-in or from the Teams client as shown on the right side. Please remember that an end user can continue to join meetings from the respective clients regardless of mode. The Skype for Business with Teams collaboration only mode is a mode that we use to separate out the chat, calling, and meeting functionality in Skype for Business and the collaboration functionality within Teams. Now, in this particular mode, from a calling and chat perspective, incoming voice over IP calls or VoIP calls, as well as incoming chats, will land in the Skype for Business client, regardless of where they were initiated. The end user that has this mode applied can initiate calls and initiate chats from only their Skype for Business client. Since that Skype for Business client is controlling chats and calling, the Skype for Business client will be responsible for presence being shown to both systems. Now, as you can see in the screenshot in the bottom left, the Skype for Business client is essentially unchanged because the user is using all of the features and functions that Skype for Business currently provided. The screenshot that you see on the right side of calling and chat is an indication of potentially what the Teams client will look like in the Skype for Business with Teams collaboration-only mode. This UI is not final, as we are continuing to evolve this user interface based on the app's permissions policy settings that we're currently working through. But the idea here is that the Teams application would not show the particular modalities that are not available, which would be calling and chat in this particular instance. Now, on the right side of this slide, from a meetings perspective, when this mode is applied to a user, meeting scheduling is only available through Skype for Business. As such, when the user opens up their Outlook client, we will only show the Skype for Business add-in in their Outlook client. We will not show the Teams add-in. Additionally, as you can see with the screenshot on the far right, we don't have any option to schedule a meeting from within the Teams application either. Now again, regardless of mode that is assigned to a user, the end user can always join meetings from their respective clients. The Skype for Business with Teams collaboration and meetings mode, which is also known as Meetings First, allows us to utilize the Skype for Business client for chat and calling, and the Teams client for meeting scheduling and collaboration. On the left, as we break down calling and chat, incoming voice over IP calls and chats will land in Skype for Business, regardless of where they were initiated. In this mode, the end user can initiate calls and chats from only the Skype for Business client. And since the Skype for Business client maintains chat and calling, it will also control the presence experience that is shown in both systems. Now you see the screenshot on the bottom left is our Skype for Business client, and it's relatively unchanged because the feature sets that Skype for Business is providing here are pretty much on par with what Skype for Business already provides. Of course, we are now moving the meetings workload into Teams, but the Skype for Business client can still be used to join meetings. And as such, the meeting app will still be there inside of the Skype for Business client. Now, on the screenshot on the right of the calling and chat for the Teams application, we're still working on the final user interface for this, but essentially the application will be tailored such that we only show the respective modalities that we are enabling for Teams, which in this case would be the collaboration features, which you can see highlighted by Teams here in the screenshot, but also the meetings experience, allowing the user to be able to gain access to scheduling and participating in meetings. As we move to the right-hand side under meetings, in this particular mode, meeting scheduling is available only within Teams. As such, in Outlook, we will replace the Skype for Business add-in with the Teams meeting add-in, ensuring that when the user uses Outlook, they can only schedule new Teams meetings from the Outlook add-in. We will also light up in the screenshot that you see on the far right in the Teams application, in the meetings experience, the ability to schedule a meeting from within the Teams application. Now again, remember, regardless of mode that is assigned to the user, the end user can always join meetings from the respective clients. Islands mode is the default mode that we have in Office 365, and in this mode, the user is expected to run both applications side by side. All of the features are available between both of the respective applications. So again, as we look in our upper right corner here, from a Skype for Business perspective, I have chat, calling, and meetings. And on the Teams side, I have chat, calling, meetings, and collaboration. Thus, the user is running both clients, and in this case, with overlapping feature sets between the two. Now, from a calling and chat perspective, when a user is in islands, incoming voice over IP calls or VoIP calls and chats will land in the same client as the originator. So if the first person, which would be Alice, sends a message to our second person, which is Bob, and Bob is in islands, Alice utilizes Teams to send her message. That message will land in Teams for Bob. If Alice uses Skype for Business to send the message, it will land in Skype for Business for Bob. So incoming VoIP calls and chats will land in the same client as the originator. As an end user, I have the choice. I can initiate calls and chats from either place. So you'll notice my Skype for Business client remains unchanged, right? I can still see my buddy list. I can start chats, conversations, and so on and so forth from there. Likewise, in my Teams client, I have all of the feature sets available to me here. Thus, I can go into chat and start a new chat or call from there. Now, in this instance, presence will be separate for these particular applications. So the presence that I show in Teams will be shown to other Teams folks, and the presence that I show in Skype for Business will be shown to other Skype for Business folks. There is no interoperability when we're dealing with islands because the two applications are effectively separated from each other. From a meetings perspective, meeting scheduling will be available on both services, both Skype for Business as well as Teams. And as a result, Outlook will show both add-ins. You see my screenshot at the bottom here. I have both the Skype for Business and Teams meeting add-ins. That means the end user could choose to schedule meetings from either client. I also could join meetings from any client as well, just as we had seen before. Now, islands is the simplest, most straightforward mode that we can utilize, but it is going to require some good user communication to avoid confusion and ensure that we drive usage towards Microsoft Teams. The Skype for Business only mode essentially allows us to utilize our existing Skype for Business feature set. As you notice in the upper right-hand corner here, I have Skype for Business handling the chat, calling, and meetings workloads, and I don't yet have Teams introduced into the environment. For this particular set of users, from a calling and chat perspective, the incoming VoIP calls and chats, of course, are going to land in Skype for Business, regardless of where they were initiated. As an end user, I can only initiate chats and calls from Skype for Business, and my Skype for Business presence, of course, will be shown in both systems because Skype is essentially the authoritative application for chat, calling, and meetings. In this case, I will have interoperability available when I'm talking to a Teams-only user. Now, we'll dive a little bit deeper into interoperability coming up here in a few slides. From a meetings perspective, meeting scheduling is only going to be available in Skype. And as a result, Outlook will only show the Skype for Business add-in, as we see here. Now, even though I can only schedule meetings from Skype for Business, again, I can join Skype for Business and Teams meetings. And you see in my screenshot here, as I pivot to my Meetings tab, I actually have two meetings, one being a normal Skype for Business meeting, which I can just click join and we'll just join natively through Skype. But notice I've also been invited to a Microsoft Teams meeting here. Perhaps one of my colleagues has already been upgraded to Teams only mode, but I haven't. But they've invited me to a Teams meeting. Not a problem. I will see this meeting on my calendar, and when I click join, I will either join with the Teams client if I happen to have it installed, or if I don't have it installed, I can join this through the Teams web experience. And again, we make sure that we take a look at the requirements that we have for utilizing the Teams web experience. I need to utilize Edge, for example, if I want the full fidelity audio-video experience inside of the web. Managing coexistence between Skype for Business and Teams, we need to ensure that we have our Azure AD Connect or synchronization between our on-premises directory and Azure Active Directory well in hand. This is the most critical requirement, especially for Teams when the customer has a Skype for Business server. You can see in our AKA-MS link here some additional details around the Azure AD Connect components. Proper synchronization is required prior to creating Teams users. If this synchronization is not in place, we'll risk duplication of user accounts, some duplication of various DNS entries, which in turn will result in broken routing experiences and broken policy assignments. So it's most critical that we have our synchronization at hand, including the synchronization of the required MS-RTC SIP attributes from the on-premises environment to Azure Active Directory. Also, as we look at managing coexistence, we need to ensure that we have hybrid or split domain configured between our on-premises Skype for Business deployment and Skype for Business Online. You can read more about that at the aka.ms link on this slide. Now, while hybrid is not required, there will be a lot that is lost if this is not in place. This is in fact required for interoperability to Teams. So if we do not have hybrid or split domain configured between the on-premises Skype for Business deployment and the Office 365 tenant, we will not be able to have interoperability between Teams users and Skype for Business on-premises users within that same tenant. It is also required for the migration from on-premises Skype for Business server to both Skype for Business Online as well as Microsoft Teams. This will be critical as we release updated cumulative updates to Skype for Business Server 2015, as well as Skype for Business Server 2019, which will facilitate a single-step migration process from on-premises directly to Teams. Now let's take a look at presence and coexistence. First, let's level set a few things. First off, what is presence? Presence is, by definition, what we call the reachability over chat and calling. So essentially, can I reach out to this particular person via chat or via a call? Chat and calling work together. The presence components, the backend infrastructure components, the various user scenarios and coexistence modes that we've talked about all work in harmony with chat and calling. As such, you don't have an opportunity to move chat, peer-to-peer chat, separately from calling because these components are so deeply tied to one another. Now, a question that often comes up is around the concept of unified presence versus what we call intelligent presence. Previously, we had a concept known as unified presence, where we would effectively aggregate your presence between both Teams and Skype for Business to create this one unified look of presence. After a lot of feedback from customers, we realized that this wasn't a great way to determine reachability for all the various scenarios. So we no longer have unified presence. Instead, we published the proper presence to the proper system. That is what's known as intelligent presence. So for example, with Islands, both of our clients have the capability of doing chat and calling. As a result, both clients should publish presence separately to their own system. So Teams will publish its presence into Teams. Skype for Business will publish its presence into Skype for Business when we are in Islands. If a user is upgraded into Teams only mode, in that particular mode, chat and calling will reside only in Teams. As such, Teams should be intelligent enough to publish presence and own presence to both systems. So the Teams client will publish presence to Teams as well as Skype for Business watchers. For the Skype for Business modes, what we refer to on the slide here as SfB star, that's the Skype for Business only, Skype for Business collab, and Skype for Business collab and meetings modes. In those particular modes, chat and calling reside within Skype for Business. So as a result, Skype for Business will own presence and publish to both systems in that specific instance. Let's dig a little bit deeper into interop. Level setting some terms here. What is interop? By definition, interop is communication between a Skype for Business user and a Teams user. In the chat and calling perspective, this is very simple, basic communication designed to be one-to-one or peer-to-peer communication occurring in plain text chat. So no capabilities for emojis or Giphies or things of that nature. And when we talk about interop here and these particular capabilities, these are identical in both the in-tenant cases, so users within the same company, as well as federated use cases and users between organizations currently today. Now, from an advanced features perspective, there are some workarounds that are partially available today to mitigate some of the shortcomings that we have from an interop perspective. One of the workarounds is to be able to create a meeting that provides a full featured experience for the respective users. So being able to start a desktop share or something of that nature between a Skype and a Teams user, but effectively have that automatically escalate into a meeting. This feature is available today when the Skype for Business user initiates it to a Teams user, but it is not currently available the other way around. We're continuing to work on that particular scenario from Teams to Skype for Business. Now, why do we need interop? Well, once a user has been upgraded to Teams only, they no longer have the capability of initiating a chat or a call from their Skype for Business client. Thus, we need to be able to allow those Teams only users to communicate with folks that have not yet upgraded to Teams. This is very applicable inside an organization when you're doing your upgrade. Maybe you don't upgrade the entire org at once. So as that's being staggered across the organization, you'll have some people in Teams only and some not. You may need an opportunity to allow those users to chat with a Skype for Business user. Also, your entire organization may upgrade to Teams only mode very rapidly, but partner organizations that you work with may not. So we need to be able to facilitate cross-org scenarios during and after the migration, such that as I'm working with a partner organization, I can still chat with them even though they have not yet begun their upgrade to Teams. Now, are there some prerequisites from an interop perspective? Absolutely. When we're looking at an on-premises deployment of Skype for Business, we need to configure hybrid or split domain topology between the on-premises Skype for Business org and the Office 365 tenant. Now, the user that is using Teams to initiate the interop conversation, that particular Teams user must have their Skype for Business account in Skype for Business Online to light up the ability for them to do interop chats and calls. Now, they can talk to any destination, whether it's online or on premises. It's just simply that particular Teams user that needs to make sure that his Skype for Business account is online to light up the one-to-one interop chat and calling experience. If you have a user that is utilizing Teams, but their corresponding Skype for Business account is on premises, they're not going to have the ability to do interop, nor are they going to have the ability to do federation either, because that's built on top of the interop experience. So let's break down the interop flows conceptually so that we can see what's actually happening behind the scenes. So let's go through a couple of scenarios. Now, to set the stage here, the first scenario that we're looking at is a Skype for Business online user. This user is now talking to a Teams only user. So if we follow along on the screen here, this is my Skype for Business user. Now again, the SfB star refers to any of the Skype for Business coexistence modes. So Skype for Business only, Skype for Business with Teams Collab, Skype for Business with Teams Collab and Meetings. They all function the same way from a routing perspective. So here's my first user, user A. They have Skype for Business Online. They're not currently using Teams, so that's grayed out. Over here is the person that user A is talking to. This is user B. They are in Teams only mode. So they do have a Skype for Business Online account, but of course they're not able to use that particular account because they are in Teams only mode. How do I know they have a Skype for Business Online account? Well, I wouldn't be able to assign the Teams only mode without it, right? That's one of the requirements to assign a user Teams only mode is their corresponding Skype for Business account must be online. Now, to facilitate interoperability between Skype for Business and Teams, we've built a gateway inside of our service in Office 365. This is completely managed by the service. This is not anything you need to deploy or enable or turn on. It just simply is there and works. Now, let's take a look at the scenario that we have here. Skype online user talking to Teams only user. When the Skype user wants to talk to the Teams only user, from the Skype perspective, it actually looks like they're talking to another Skype for Business online user. The service, however, realizes that this user is enabled as a Teams-only user, will redirect the conversation to the gateway, which will have the conversation then appear in this particular user's Teams client. That now establishes our interop thread between the Skype for Business online user and our Teams-only user. Now let's take a look at scenario number 2. The only thing we've really changed in this scenario is user A now has their Skype account on premises. They do not have Teams currently because they are, let's say for this example, they're assigned the Skype for Business with Teams collab mode, right? So they would have the ability to do their chat here. They don't have the Teams client available from a chat perspective. Now, in this example, this is an on-premises user. We do in fact have hybrid or split domain configured between the on-premises Skype deployment and the Office 365 tenant. Here's our Teams only user, much as we saw before, right? Skype for Business Online account. The account actually isn't available for them because they have been upgraded to Teams only, and we have our corresponding gateway. Same item holds true in this particular example. When user A goes to talk to user B, as far as user A is concerned, he believes he's talking to a Skype for Business account online. The service realizes that this particular user is upgraded to Teams, sends the request to the gateway over to their Teams client, and we have now established our interop thread. Interesting side note, once we get this interop thread established, the user's Skype for Business client on this end can now pop the little yellow banner that indicates that the user on the other side actually is not using Skype for Business. Now, let's take a look at an interop flow scenario where we introduce islands coexistence mode into the mix. So here, scenario number 3. First sub-scenario here, we have islands mode for user A, and in this case, the user's Skype for Business account is in Skype for Business Online. They are also utilizing Teams because it's islands. They have full access to all of the features inside of Teams. They are going to be communicating with a Teams-only user, which is user B. Again, user B does in fact have a Skype for Business Online account, but that account is not available because they have been upgraded to Teams, hence they are in Teams-only mode. And as mentioned before, we have our interop gateway available, which again is part of the service, not anything that you need to enable or configure. When the user that is in islands, or user A, uses his Teams account, or Teams client, I should say, to talk to the Teams only user, that communication will happen natively inside of Teams. That's the definition of islands, right? Communication starts in Teams, lands in Teams. In the instance where user A now wants to send the communication from their Skype for Business client, well, Teams only users, they have that shadow Skype for Business account, but they don't have the ability to use their Skype for Business client for chat anymore. And as such, when user A sends the message with their Skype client, again, from user A's perspective, this just looks like a regular conversation to another Skype user, but the service will route this to the gateway and send the message over to Teams. We've now established an interop thread. Important to note here that the routing mechanisms, as you can see, are driven by the coexistence mode that is assigned to the target user, which in this example is user B. So yes, user A is in islands, but they are talking to a user that is in Teams only mode. And that user, by definition, can receive calls and chats in Teams only. Now let's take this the next step, where we see scenario 3B, which is islands mode for user A, but in this case, their Skype for Business account is homed on premises. Again, we do have the requisite hybrid topology or split domain configured. We still have user B here with his Teams only, so his shadow Skype for Business Online account, Teams only, and our gateway. Again, if the islands user utilizes his Teams application to talk to user B, that will occur natively inside of the Teams app, Teams to Teams. If the user uses their Skype for Business account Even though their Skype for Business account is on premises, this still works just fine because, again, we go through this hybrid path, and as far as the Skype client is concerned, they're talking to a Skype for Business online user. We take care of the rest in the service to route this to the gateway and over to their Teams application, such that we can then establish this interop thread between Teams and Skype for Business on premises. Now let's look at our next scenario. In this case, we're going to look at a user that is leveraging islands that wants to speak to a user that is in one of the SfB modes, one of the Skype for Business modes. So an SfB star mode. So Skype for Business only, Skype with Teams collab, Skype with Teams collab and meetings, one of those three modes. So here's user A. They are in islands. They have a Skype for Business online account. They of course have a Teams account, right? And they are using both applications with all features available. User B, in this example, they have a Skype for Business account. They do not have a Teams account because they're in one of the SfB star modes, so they don't have any chat or calling capabilities inside of Teams. And of course, we do have our gateway here. Now, in this example, when the user that's in islands uses their Teams client and they want to talk to user B, well, user B can only receive messages within their Skype client. Teams, from the client's perspective, will actually send this to our gateway, which will be able to route this message through Skype for Business Online over to Skype for Business. This will establish an interop thread between user A's Teams client and user B's Skype for Business client. This scenario shifts things just a little bit by indicating that our islands user, in this case, has their corresponding Skype for Business account on premises. So let's recap here. This is user A. Their Skype for Business account is homed on premises. They do have an enabled Teams account. We have the requisite hybrid topology in place, split domain. In this case, we're going to be talking to a Skype for Business user, as we saw before with user B, so they are not enabled in Teams. And we have a corresponding gateway available. Now, this is where we have a bit of a challenge with islands and an on-premises Skype for Business account for user A. And it comes from the fact that when this Teams user, user A, wants to chat with user B is not enabled for Teams. So when we talk to the gateway here, the gateway will realize, yep, user B is in fact not enabled for Teams. I'm going to need to find a way to route this through Skype for Business. Unfortunately, there is no corresponding online Skype for Business account for user A. And the gateway does not have a mechanism to be able to connect to the Skype for Business on-premises account. As such, because user A does not have a Skype for Business Online account, they're not able to use this interop gateway. That means this user that is in islands with their corresponding account for Skype for Business on-premises cannot use Teams to communicate with any of the users that are in the SfB star mode. They also cannot use Teams to perform any kind of federation either, because that would need to leverage this same gateway. As a result, this user that's in islands with their Skype account on premises, if they want to be able to talk to an SfB user here, they're going to have to use their Skype for Business client. Now, if we dig a little deeper into the interop chat and calling routing experience, it's going to look like this. First and foremost, routing is always determined by the coexistence mode that is assigned to the recipient or the target, right? So as we look at the table that you see here on this slide, first the originator would start with their client of choice. The next thing we need to determine is what client they have used and where the originator Skype for Business account is homed. Is that homed online or is that homed on premises? That will then help us determine whether the conversation is even possible or not. So, for example, if I look at this chart, this first section here, these three columns are the originator. That would be user A in the conceptual diagrams that we saw earlier. If they are in islands, of course, the user would have a choice to start the conversation in Teams or the Skype client. If they're in one of the SfB star modes, right? Again, noted down here what the SfB star modes mean. They can only use the Skype for Business client to actually initiate a chat or a call. Likewise, if they're in Teams only mode, they could only use the Teams client to initiate a chat or a call. So we would use this matrix to determine, okay, where is the originator, what mode, what client, and where is their corresponding Skype for Business account homed? And then we look to the right side here, these three columns, which are the target, or user B, as we saw in our logical slides earlier. This will determine whether it's even feasible or whether it lands in the Teams client or the Skype for Business client. Now, it's pretty easy to take a look at here. If you look at this chart, if the target user is assigned the SfB star mode, of course it's going to land in the Skype for Business client, with one big exception that we have here in red, and that was the example we showed on the prior slide. If user A is in islands, using their Teams client, and user A's Skype for Business account is on premises, they will not be able to talk to a user that is in the SfB star modes because we don't have the ability to utilize the gateway. Outside of that, islands, Teams lands in Teams, Skype lands in Skype. Same thing if their account is on premises, Teams lands in Teams, Skype for Business lands in Skype for Business. Right? That's the definition of islands. Now again, here when I say target Skype for Business, this could be Skype for Business online or on premises from a target perspective. It doesn't matter, right? We do support the ability to talk to on-prem and online Skype for Business accounts, no worries. The last column is the simplest of all, which is if the user is in Teams only mode, the conversation, the chat, the call will always land in Teams. The major difference here is the ones that are shaded and colored in here indicate that this is an interop conversation because the originator is starting in Skype and it's landing in Teams, right? Whereas the ones that are not highlighted are Teams to Teams conversations. Let's take a closer look at the concept of federation. Federation, by definition, is communication between a user in tenant A and a user in tenant B. Whereas before, when we were looking at our previous interop discussions, we were looking at conversations happening within a tenant. Federation, by definition, is conversations happening between tenants. So how does federation work? Currently, as of this recording, we are utilizing a V1 of Teams Federation, which leverages the Skype for Business Federation infrastructure. So in V1, every federated communication that involves Teams is basically an interop conversation or an interop thread between Skype for Business and Teams. That means we have the same requirements that we would have for interop. That also means we have the same limitations that we would have for interop. Meaning basic, clear, a simple text chat, no emoticons, no emojis, things of that nature. We are working on V2 of Teams Federation upcoming, which will provide native Teams to Teams federation and allow us to remove some of those restrictions that we had in an interop situation. Does federation work today? Yep, federation is available in the public cloud. The focus on Teams only, of course, is where we're looking from a federation perspective. If interop doesn't work, federation will not work either. And we covered that in our logical breakdowns of interop. So for example, if the user has user A is in islands mode and they are using Teams and they have their corresponding Skype for Business account homed on premises, they would not be able to do interop. Thereby, they would also not be able to do federation as well. We are working to light up presence to on-premises Skype for Business server deployments in Q4 here, calendar year 18, as well as lighting up the federated contacts inside of your Teams client. The federated contacts actually are migrated from Skype for Business into Teams. We just haven't enabled lighting them up in the client yet, but we're working to close that gap this Q4 of calendar year 18 as well. How does Federation get deployed? Well, it's configured in both the Skype for Business admin center and the Skype and Teams admin center, where we turn external communications on. We can choose open federation. We can do allow a list matching and so forth. Obviously, for the full featured experience, we have the concept of leveraging a meeting instead, because that would give them their full fidelity experience as opposed to leveraging interop from that connectivity perspective. Let's take a look at a breakdown chart of federation chat and calling routing. This is for net new chats and calls. Much like we saw earlier with the interop table, the routing is always determined by the recipient's mode. Then the way we read this chart is first to look at the originator's client of choice, and then where the originator's Skype for Business account is homed. Then we can look at the corresponding columns under the target to determine whether this will land in the Skype client, whether it will land in the Teams client, or whether it's not even possible. And from a federation standpoint, the chart is actually pretty straightforward to read. From an originator standpoint, again, the mode that's assigned to the user, if it's islands, that means that they could use either their Teams or their Skype for Business client to initiate a chat or a call. If they're in one of the SfB star modes, as noted down here, of course, they can only use their Skype for Business client to initiate chats and calls. And conversely, if they are in Teams only mode, they can only use their Teams client to initiate chats and calls. And the reason I say this is a pretty straightforward table to read is because when the target or the recipient is in islands or is in the SfB star modes, will always land in their Skype for Business client, with one exception, and that exception is marked right here in red, the big old NA, right? And we've covered that in previous examples as well. That's the scenario where user A is in islands using their Teams client, but their corresponding Skype for Business account for user A is on premises. They're not able to do interop in that scenario, which then means they're also not able to do federation in that scenario either, which is why this entire row is listed as NA. If the user B or the target here is in Teams only, of course, then it will land in Teams, regardless of where the user initiates the conversation from, of course, with the exception that we noted here. And lastly, like we saw before, if we look at this table, anything that's shaded, any of the cells that are shaded here indicate that this is an interop conversation as opposed to a non-interop thread. Let's recap our key learnings from this training. Coexistence, by definition, involves both Skype for Business and Teams working together in the same organization. You will utilize coexistence modes to control the user experience for the upgrade. When utilizing an upgrade from Skype for Business on-premises, proper Azure AD synchronization is critical, and hybrid is necessary and recommended. Be sure to check out the other trainings that are part of this series of the Skype to Teams upgrade. Thank you for attending this session.